Ayo, back at it again with another video. Thank you for watching. I greatly appreciate it. So, I've been meaning to talk about this for a while now. I've wanted to touch on this topic, the party switch. So, I'll talk about these four pictures, and then I'll get into why I think the party switch happened. So, we'll start on the Democratic side. The Democratic Party started out, and especially from the Civil War era and then post Civil War, the Reconstruction era, it was mostly the party of Southern white voters. And, as we know, our Civil War history, we know that North and South fighting the Civil War over slavery, the South wanted to keep slaves, North was abolitionist. That party that was dominated by Southern white voters in the former Confederacy ultimately then went on to elect the first black president. You have the multicultural coalition that supported Obama in 2008 and 2012. And then, so that's, the switch on the Democratic side. The switch on the Republican side. So you got the party of Lincoln, and then ultimately, once Lincoln was assassinated, then party of Grant. So Grant was the Union general, and then rose to the rank of commander of all Union forces. He was the head of the Union Army. The surrendered Appomattox from General Lee was given to General Grant, and then Grant ultimately went on to become a president of the United States on the Republican side. And this bottom picture down here, we got a picture from January 6th. Republican Trump supporter waving the Confederate flag in the Capitol. So as you can see from these just four screenshots or pictures, you kind of catch a glimpse of the party switch on both sides. The Democratic Party, a party that was, mostly landowning white Southern voters, ultimately then went on. The party then evolved over time, and then the first black president, Barack Obama, 2008, 2012. And the switch on the Republican side, went from the party of Lincoln and the party of Grant, who were Northerners fighting the South, to you got Republican Trump supporter waving a Confederate flag in the Capitol. So very interesting party switch. So let's go through a couple different. So this is on 270 to win. This is the maps of all the presidential elections. So early presidential history was mostly states in the East. You had your original 13 colonies, plus a couple others. If you look at most of these, Washington obviously won pretty handily both times. Then it started to really devolve down to the Northeast, New England versus the rest of the country. You can kind of see that in 1812. You can see that in 1808. It's mostly that part of the country. 1800, northeast versus the rest of the country. And then from like 1816, 1820, Monroe won pretty handily. And then there's a period in here where there's like a lot of 3 and 4-way races. 1824 is a 3-way race. 1832 is Van Buren won in 1836. That's a 3 or 4, even 5 different candidates. But ultimately, once you get to 1856, 1860, the differences really start to solidify. In the early American history, you have mostly Northeast New England, New York, New England, against the rest of the country. But once you get to about 1856, 1860, you really start to see that it's north and obviously a little bit of west versus the south. So if you look at 1856 to 1860, you can see red for Republicans in the north, blue for Democrats in the south. And the South in politics is referred to as the Solid South because there's a lot of times when the South votes the same. As you can see in 1880, the South votes all blue in 84, all blue in 88, all blue in 92, all blue in 08, all blue in 04. And more or less the map doesn't change. 1856, 1860, the map doesn't really change a whole lot. Obviously there's some differences, but more or less it's north and west versus south. 1896, you have the south and the plains versus the north and the west in a coalition. And you look at it, and the South has voted pretty solidly blue, and this up to this point. 1912 is not a great example because the Republican electorate was split between Teddy and Taft, and then ultimately Wilson. The Democratic electorate was not split in half, so he won pretty handily. Oopsies. There we go. But we're looking and we're seeing, obviously, there's landslides in 28 for Hoover, landslides 32, 36, 40, 44 for FDR. If you look at the landslides for Eisenhower, the South is pretty commonly still blue at that point. It starts to fracture in the 60s in the Civil Rights Movement. That has a lot to do with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 68, 64 even. 64, Lyndon Johnson won pretty handily, but the South didn't like his civil rights policy. 68, you can see that pretty handily with, I think it's Wallace. Yeah, split the vote down here in the South. Nixon won pretty handily in 72. There's a lot of Republican wins in this part of it. Yeah, 80, 84, 88. 76. The Democrats, since Civil Rights Act has been passed, the only times the Democrats have done really well in the South is when a Democratic Southern governor is on the ticket. So Jimmy Carter was the governor of Georgia. The Democratic governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, 92, 96. You can see they did decent, but as you can see, the South over time has transitioned away from voting pretty overwhelmingly blue. And if you go to the 80s, 80, 84, 88, even up to 2000, 2004, you can see that it completely shifted away. And you can honestly look at the same thing with a different part of the country, the Northeast, but I'll get into that in a second. Yeah, the South has voted. It was predominantly Democratic post-Civil War up to about 1940s, and then there was fracturing with Lyndon Johnson's civil rights legislation. Okay, let's look at the Northeast, because the Northeast has also gone through a little bit of a shift. So if you look at 2020, most of the Northeast, you have Virginia all the way up to Maine. It's pretty solidly blue. For a long time there, that part of the country was pretty Republican. So if you look at 88, pretty split. 84, 80, pretty overwhelmingly Republican. 76, pretty split. 72, overwhelmingly Republican. In the 50s, voted overwhelmingly Republican. 48, if you look at 48, pretty solidly red. If you look at the FDR years, the only pretty Republican up here. Vermont, Maine were the only two states that didn't vote for him in 1936. So at that time of the country, that at that time in our country's history, that part of the country was pretty red. If you look at it, that part of the country red in 24 and 20, red in 16, 1912 was that three-way race. But if you look at over time, that part of the country, since the Civil War, so red, voted red, will split a little bit, but voted Republican, split, but mostly voted Republican, mostly Republican through the 1880s. You can take a peek. Obviously, the FDR years, landslide for Democrats, but Republicans were winning the Northeast pretty consistently. And then in the 1990s, ever since the 1992 election, the Northeast has voted pretty solidly Democrat with a couple of exceptions. New Hampshire in 2000 voted Republican. Pennsylvania voted red, voted Republican in 2016. But if you look at the maps, New England and the Northeast has gone from voting traditionally Republican to voting Democrat. And the South has gone from voting pretty solidly blue, pretty solidly Democrat, to voting very predominantly Republican. And that shift is really emphasized in the 70s, 80s, and by the early 2000s, it's pretty solidified. The states of the former Confederacy voted Republican 2000, 2004. There's a little bit of fracturing in 2008 and 12, but in 2016, the only former state of the Confederacy that voted Democrat was Virginia. But yeah, so let's just go through the list of presidents real quick. So we got Lincoln. So he was election of 1860. John C. Fremont was the Republican in 1856. So if we hop back over to the maps, yeah, John C. Fremont versus Buchanan. So this is the 1860 election is pretty much when the two parties that we now have are solidified. So the party of Lincoln and the party of Grant, the president of the Union during the Civil War and the commanding general of all Union forces, commanding general of the U.S. Army, 1864. So he was then president, 18th president. So the party of Lincoln and Grant has switched to the party of a dude waving a Confederate flag in the Capitol on January 6th, which is ironic. But it's also ironic because the Democrats have gone from a party that was the party of white landowning Southerners, states of the former Confederacy, that then, in 2008, the parties have really switched over time and voted a multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-generational coalition voting for Obama in 2008 and 12. I just find this stuff fascinating because this is it's mind-blowing. It's kind of crazy to me. Like the party of Lincoln and Grant, there's Republican supporters are now waving Confederate flags in the Capitol, and Democrats, the former party of white landowning Southerners, elected Barack Obama in 2008. It's wild to me. It really is. But yeah, I think American politics is very fascinating. I think obviously politics is not usually what you would want to talk about over Thanksgiving dinner. Maybe you have an aunt or uncle or cousin that doesn't agree with you politically, but to me, American politics is fascinating. But yeah, it's very interesting. So just my opinion, just my 2 cents on the matter. If you're looking for when the parties really switched on policy, you have to mainly look at the Roosevelt's presidents. So Teddy Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt. So at that point in time, progressives were mostly in the Republican Party, and then there was the whole New Deal coalition, and they really switched on economic policy during the Great Depression. So FDR rose to prominence because he had these New Deal programs, Social Security, whatnot, and that's pretty much when they switched on economic policy. On social policy, you can kind of see that in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Again, just look at the South, just look at the Northeast in these pictures. The Northeast was predominantly Republican, and now in 2020 it votes predominantly Democrat. In post Civil War up to the 1940s, and even a little bit beyond, the South voted predominantly Democrat, and now the South votes predominantly Republican. So the clues are there. You just have to know where to look and know how to find them. But the parties definitely switched. Whether or not you agree with that, that's up to you. So, just my opinion on the matter, just my 2 cents, and I'm gonna wrap it up. And that is the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Deuces.